Here they come.
Here they come.
Hello.
Hi, good evening.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Not too bad.
Good, good.
Hi, Sue.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Good.
Tired.
Yeah, I hear you.
Hey, Christy.
Hey Barb, how are you?
Okay.
Nice you guys could join. These are
Yeah,
some of,
Good.
thanks for the invite. That's great.
we wanted to open it to our families first, but thought
Mhm.
that other people could certainly benefit. It's a big issue for us.
Yeah, no, that's great.
I'll just give everybody a few minutes. We've got a couple people still coming in, and then I'll do some introductions.
I keep getting the same pop-up about a Ken again. Am I supposed to be doing something here?
Yeah, I think you should give everybody a couple minutes to make sure that they're all here.
Yeah, I will. Hi, Sarah. How are you? We might have some scragglers that come in a little bit, a few minutes late, but I'll just continue to admit everybody as we go along. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This is a big deal for all of us because this is something that we
I'll talk to you later.
Oh.
Okay.
I'm gonna join in too, okay?
All right, I think I might mute everybody.
Okay.
All participants.
Bye.
Don't mute is everything muted and they're on the phone.
Let's see here. All right, guys. Okay. All right. I just want to thank Dr. Templeman for joining us tonight. This is a big issue for many of our families, and it's great that he's taking the time to spend with us tonight. We are going to be recording the event tonight, and just so you know, so that if there's other families who would like to participate and watch this at a later date, I've opened the chat to myself. So if you do have any questions and want to be able to ask something, we'll leave some time at the end for some questions for Dr. Templeman. So Dr. Templeman is a child and adolescent psychiatrist who works out of London. And I think probably a few of you are familiar with him, as you may have already received, or your child may have received a diagnosis at that time from Dr. Templeman. So there might be a few friendly faces out there for you. So I'm going to turn my video off and hand it over to Dr. Templeman. And if there's anything else, or if there's any questions later on, you can always respond to the autism info email that the Zoom came through. So you can reach us at a later date as well. All right, thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Templeman.
Alrighty. Nice to see so many blacked out screens. Thank you for coming, all. Now, what we're going to be talking about today is behavioral avoidance or behavioral activation in autism spectrum disorders. And part of the reason that I've got it set there as anxiety as a question mark is that not all behavioral avoidance or behavioral activation is because of anxiety, even though it may often look like that. And so what we're going to be talking about as a baseline is, what does it look like when you've got anxiety in general? What's going on in the brain? What's going on in the brain in kids that are neuroatypical or on the spectrum? What happens when you've got the overlap between the two, and what can you do about it? Now, just to let you know, I'm going to be giving a very quick review of the first two topics on anxiety and on an ASD on my website, which is drtempleman.com. If you want more information or you're feeling a little bit behind, there are other presentations that I've done over the years that have been recorded specifically on these topics and are posted there. And this presentation will also be recorded and posted on my website probably by the end of the week. So it's certainly worthwhile going and watching those presentations to give you a much better background and understanding on those topics specifically. All right. So in terms of what's going on in the brain of a child when we're talking about an anxious child, what happens in the brain, what makes us feel anxious or experience anxiety, is the result of two very basic processes that occur in our brain that have a very specific designation, which is to keep us alive. In our brains, we are almost always paying attention to the dangers that are in our environment in order to protect ourselves. And this happens 24/7, constantly, at a very primitive level, very automatic processing that is based on what are we looking at, what are we seeing, what are we hearing, what are we tasting, sensing, in order to identify the dangers that are our environment so that we can avoid them, as well as the other process, which is, again, focused on survival, which is to teach us about or make us be aware of stuff that we need for our continued survival, for our pleasure and existence, things like food and water and warmth and physical contact, things that, again, are necessary for our survival. Now, because I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist and I deal with kids a lot, and to simplify it, I've given these two processes names and faces to make it much easier. I call them Jim and Bob. And Jim and Bob, representing our pleasure-seeking drives and our harm avoidance drives, essentially run us like a puppet on a string every day of our lives. They control what we do, when we do it, how we do it, from the day we're born until the day we die. Now, when you're talking about Bob, the harm avoidance drive, the important things to know about Bob are that Bob is a function of our sensory input. So Bob is always paying attention to everything that we see, hear, taste, smell, touch, feel, filtering all of this sensory information through its database of things to be careful and to watch out for in order to identify things that are a risk to us, things that could hurt us or cause us harm or essentially kill us. And when Bob sees something out there that represents danger, that is a bad thing, what Bob does is he takes over control of our body and he forces us into a series of actions that is designed to make sure that we avoid that bad thing, that we stay out of the line of fire, out of danger, and react to protect ourselves. So what does Bob look like in action? This is what he looks like in action. As soon as Bob sees something that is potentially bad, he takes control and he makes you react. So in this particular example, you've got a child that is looking at a big fake spider. Now the child knows it's a toy spider, but when the toy spider lunges at him, Bob sees a danger coming and immediately makes this boy backpedal, get away, fall over, do whatever it takes to get out of the way of that spider. And the thing to recognize about this is that this isn't something that that boy is choosing to do. We never choose to react according to what Bob tells us to do. We simply do, almost instantaneously, reflexively. It is very much a mental reflex that happens so quickly, we don't have a chance to just shut it down and say, I don't think that's reasonable. As we get older, it really doesn't change. We still end up taking immediate action and do what we need to do to survive. Now, if you watch this little clip very carefully and pay attention to girl number 2 in the video, these are 3 friends out on a beach. Suddenly, they become terrified of this monstrous monkey that's about to go kill them. And in order to survive, girl number 2 grabs girl number 3's arm, throws her to the wolves in order to get away so that she can survive. Now, this isn't something I'm sure that she thought about, thinking, oh, you know what? I should grab somebody else in order to propel myself to safety and let them get eaten. This is an automatic reflex that happens in order to be able to survive. Now, how does Bob know what is bad? Well, that's pretty easy. In our brains, we are hardwired to know that certain things are always going to be bad. And some things are fairly universal and have been identified in our brains as bad right from the get-go. Things like dark, big things, heights, things that literally over the evolutionary millennia that we've been around have represented very real dangers. But the most important way that we know what is bad and that Bob filters these incoming inputs is through experience. When we experience something bad, our brain pays very close attention to what was happening right before it in order to be able to predict what is going to tell us that this is coming. And so if, for example, I get bit by a dog, if that's a very bad experience in my life, if that hurt and was unpleasant, what Bob does is he takes a quick snapshot of everything that was going on right before this happened, everything that I was seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching, and encodes that information as something to be avoided because he wants to avoid the end product of that bad experience. So if right before the dog bit me, I was walking down the sidewalk and a blue car drove by, if Bob noticed that and paid attention to it, I may start feeling very anxious and scared as blue cars drive by because that may be the reminder that I'm about to get bitten by a dog. At least it was the last time it happened. If I happen to be walking by the neighbor's house in the middle of the day, Bob may decide that being outside in the middle of the day is a bad thing because the last time we were outside, we got attacked by a dog. And so the type of information that Bob is going to encode as a bad thing to avoid really depends on the sensory inputs that he pays attention to, that he's aware of, and timing. And it is always going to be what was most immediately preceding the negative event that gets most tightly linked to that bad thing to be avoided from here on out. And as we get older and we experience more and more bad things happen to us in life because life has unpleasantness associated with it, that list gets longer and longer and longer as we go. Now, things can come off of the list, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But what you often see with kids with anxiety is that as time goes on, they usually end up becoming more and more anxious and start avoiding more and more things rather than stop avoiding things. The natural progression of a child that is anxious is to become more anxious over time, not less anxious over time. Now, the flip side of this control mechanism of our bodies that keeps us alive is the pleasure-seeking drive, which is Jim. And Jim's job is very much like Bob's job, keep us alive, but not by making us avoid bad stuff, but by making sure we go and get the stuff that we want and like and need for survival. Things like food, water, warmth, physical contact, things that are necessary for our existence, both as an individual and as a species. And so as Jim goes through our daily lives, he is monitoring the environment looking for good stuff. Now, what makes something good for Jim depends entirely on the brain and the neurochemicals in the brain. In our brains, good just means something that releases dopamine in our brains. So anything that I experience that leads to an elevated level of dopamine in my brain is encoded as a good thing. And very similar to Bob, whatever was happening before that becomes a predictor of those good things and becomes secondarily something to pay attention to and to go in life. Now, what is it that makes our brains release dopamine? That can be any number of things. And it is as individual as every person is. Some things, like sweets, games, fun activities, may be fairly common, fairly universal, but other things may be very uncommon. Some people really enjoy dolls. Some people really enjoy learning about flora and fauna. Some people love computers, others love sports. But at the end of the day, what is in common with every one of these things is if I am going out of my way to get these things, it means I like it, and it means that that releases dopamine in my brain. And that is a very, very important thing to be aware of, because dopamine is an antagonist to and blocks serotonin and norepinephrine through a feedback loop. So serotonin and norepinephrine are the neurochemicals associated with anxiety. And what that means is that if I am enjoying something, I am not scared and experiencing anxiety. You can't be having fun and being terrified at the same time. So if I need to do something, get something that I like, go get something that's fun, I am going to shut down this process in order to be able to do so. Now, when Jim finds something that he likes in the environment, he is just as powerful, if not more so, as Bob. And he does the same thing, takes over control of our bodies and makes us do whatever it takes to get that thing that we want. Most commonly, that means getting angry to get what I want, because not getting what I want in Jim's mind is a very dangerous, bad thing, in that if I don't eat, I'm going to die. That's a guarantee. It's not about maybe if something bad happens. It's about if you don't get enough food right away, this body is not going to continue, and that is not acceptable. So Jim activates a very powerful emotion when there are problems or obstacles between us and what we want, and that is anger. And anger is designed to make us more powerful so that we can break through whatever's between us and what we want. And at a very primitive level, that breaking through is essentially aggression, physical aggression towards the obstacle that's in our way. Be that a person, a place, a thing. We direct our anger towards the roadblock that stands between us and what we want. So here's an example of what
I want the big bag! I want that big bag! I want that big bag!
All right. It's a great commercial. It was put out a few years ago by that company. But the important thing there is this kid clearly wants that, and he is going to do whatever it takes to get it. Now, most parents, in the face of that kind of a behavioral reaction, are going to do one of two things. Either be very embarrassed and get out of there very quickly, or give him what he wants in order to avoid the embarrassment and in order to be able to continue to shop. Both may be acceptable outcomes to the child, though he might prefer the candy. But either way, what that child is going to learn from that experience is, did doing this make a difference in me getting what I wanted or not? Did this strategy work to get me what I want? Because if it happened right before that flow of dopamine, so if right before I got that, I just had a meltdown, the brain learns through the timing of the dopamine to what was going on right before that. What was I doing? What was I hearing, tasting, smelling, touching? And those things become things I'm going to seek out and do more of to get those things that I want. And this is how Jim learns his set of behaviors based on experience once again. that if I do these things, these are going to get me the things that I want in life. And so every day of our lives, as we go throughout our lives, our brains are always balancing Jim and Bob, balancing the equation between what do I want, what do I like, how do I get it, and what am I afraid of, how do I stay sure I stay away from that and avoid that. And up until about the age of 12, so puberty roughly, these two powerful drives are really the only thing that dictate our behavior. And this goes for all people, all animals, everybody and everything that is alive functions with these same two basic primitive processes. Crickets have the same types of breakdowns. So do dogs, so do cats, so do apes, so do humans. And it's always just reactionary, reflexive. Now, humans do have something that is slightly different than animals, which is a third part of our brain, which allows us to learn, to understand information at a level that is beyond just our instincts. Now, that thinking part of the brain, that information processing part of the brain, starts out primarily as a database of facts about the world, knowing stuff about the world, which once we hit puberty becomes a functional database, which then starts to go about making sure that these facts are all consistent with each other and reflect reality. And this part of the brain is essentially the logic and reasoning part of the brain, the part of the brain that thinks, helps us to understand, helps us to know what makes sense or not, and at the end of the day is supposed to be able to override and exercise control over Jim and Bob in order to make our behavior be consistent with what we know to be real. Jim and Bob have no necessary connection to reality. Jim and Bob don't care if the things that they're telling us to do and if their reactions make sense or not. And kids, prior to the onset of puberty, they don't understand what makes sense or not. They don't get if this is something that is consistent with reality or not. They just know what they want, when they want it, and what they're afraid of. You know, realistically, does it make sense to be afraid of a daddy long legs? No. No one's ever been hurt by a daddy long legs. Daddy long legs are completely harmless. Nobody could get hurt by it. Yeah, they're creepy, they look weird, but they can't hurt you. So does it make sense to react phobically and to freak out and run away and scream if a daddy long legs happens to come near you? Not even remotely. But Bob doesn't care about that. If Bob thinks it's bad, Bob's making you react. Similarly, it's just a lollipop. Does it really make sense to have this kind of a meltdown and a tantrum over a lollipop? Nope. But Jim doesn't care if it makes sense, even if there's going to be one later. If he wants something now, right now, he's going to make you react and do whatever it takes to get what he wants right now. As adults, we use logic and reason, and we try to impart some of that to our kids by teaching them, telling them, explaining to them the reasons why things happen. And we try to understand their frame of mind. We are often, as parents, asking our kids, why did you do that? Why did you react that way? And you guys are all parents, so all of you know very well exactly how our kids are going to answer that question. They all sit there and say, I don't know. And unfortunately, it's true. They really don't know why they do things because why doesn't matter to them. Why isn't a relevant question to ask? Kids don't even know what the question means, which is why they will often sit there and, as a parent, ask you the same kind of silly questions you ask them. Why? You know, why is it time for bed? Because it's 7 o'clock and, you know, the sun goes down at this time. Well, but why? Why does the sun go down? Because this is because of the rotation of the earth. But why does the earth rotate? Because of this. And you can just keep answering the questions, and every answer you get, there's going to be another, but why? But why? Until eventually you realize, I don't know. And that's essentially where they want to get you to, is the point where Yeah, it doesn't, you don't know either. See? So none of what we do makes any sense to anybody. So when we talk about anxiety specifically, outside of the context of just these two normal forces that control us, when we use the label anxiety, what we are talking about is an excess of activation of Bob, where Bob is reacting too much, too sensitively, too intensely to the environment and to bad things that are happening. Or another way of thinking about it is Bob is turning little molehills into mountains and predicting terrible outcomes when these things are not actually terrible outcomes, don't need to be there, don't need to be things that you get scared of, that you react negatively to. Now, this is a great poem by Sheldon Silverstein, nice Canadian author, that is all about anxiety. It's all about the what ifs. What if bad? 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 Nowhere in there is what if it's great? What if it turns out that I, get dollar or actually succeed and catch fish, or, they finish a war? What if everybody reconciles and everything's great? What if things are fabulous? Because Bob doesn't pay attention to what is good. He only pays attention to what is bad. And when one of the two, Jim or Bob, is in the driver's seat, the other one isn't. So when Bob is in control of what you're thinking about, what you're doing, that's all that you're going to have as the questions that pop into your head. Now, anxiety presents on a spectrum of normal to more severe, all the way up to the panic state. And everybody knows what that looks like. You're anxious, you're a little bit restless, you're kind of looking around a bit, to actually, okay, I'm scared, my heart's starting to pound, I'm feeling much more jittery, and I really kind of feel like I need to get out of here, to now I'm panicked, I'm hyperventilating, I'm not able to even think clearly, and my brain's essentially turning off. Because Bob is again making a big deal out of a little thing that does not need to be made such a big deal of. Bob is misperceiving the world around him. In essence, it's like he's looking at the world through a pair of binoculars, making everything way bigger and way worse than it needs to be. Using pictures as the best example of this, this is what Bob does if Bob is afraid of spiders. It's not just a little bad thing, it is a huge bad thing that is going to kill me. And if, as a parent, you have a child that's afraid of spiders and the child comes freaking out on you and you're like, it's just a little spider, go kill it, just go step on it. They'll all look at you like you've got 3 heads growing out of your torso because they're like, are you insane? Are you trying to get me actively eaten? Because to them, it's not just a little spider, it's actually a really big spider. And this isn't just what happens in kids, even adults that have fears, phobias, it is very much like this. They did a really interesting study in California a few years ago, specifically with arachnophobia, looking at people's perceptions of the situation. And the way that they did this study was they got people with self-described arachnophobia and very little other psychiatric problems. So it's a very clean study. And they brought them into a little room that had a nice plexiglass divider between them and the activating stimulus, which in this case was a spider. And what they did was they let the spider crawl around on the desk, just a few short feet away from the person that is terrified of spiders in a small room with a clear piece of glass. So people knew the spider couldn't get at them. They were 100% aware of this. But the goal was to see what is their perception of it when fear gets activated. Now, obviously, for some people, it's tough to go into that room. But because the investigators like to have fun, and we're specifically studying this, they made something happen that was unexpected. And that is they blew a little gust of air at the spiders. And the way that spiders sense things in their environment is through hair follicles on their legs. So when the hair follicles get brushed as a result of wind currents or things coming at them, the spider's instinct and reflex is to escape that and jump in the other direction. So they would blow a little gust of air over here, and suddenly this spider that's crawling around on the table jumps at the plexiglass. In most people, triggering a pretty good panic attack. So these people then would go home, and what they would do right before they left was rate their fear how scared were you of that spider on a scale of 1 to 10? They left, they came back a week later, same room, same environment, except this time they were just presented with a piece of paper with a little diagram of a spider, various sizes from 1 millimeter all the way up to 2.5 inches. And they said, circle the size of the spider that we exposed you to last week. And there was a very direct correlation between the perception of the size of the spider and their own self-rated level of fear that was there the week before. So the spider in reality was only 2 to 3 millimeters, but some people were marking it off as, bigger than the 3.5 inches. But very reliably, if they said they were scared, their spider was much bigger in their recollection of that event than somebody who was less afraid. Now, because there's so many things in the environment that could be dangerous, I got a bunch of different examples of what this looks like. When Bob makes a big deal out of something that really doesn't need to be that big of a deal. From fear of the weather, to fear of germs, to fear of contamination, to fear of people, of crowded places, to kids that react with fear when they're getting in trouble or getting corrected, to fear of school, of peers, to fear of failure, of standing out, of being put on the spot by others, to fear of not being able to do something, the fear of chaos, or people that are neat freaks or need to have things perfectly lined up, organized, right on into the sensory inputs, which can be anxiety based or can also be something else. But again, it's just an over representation of the badness that our brains experience and that our brains perceive these things to be. All right. Any questions so far about anxiety and the basics of that? And I'm not sure if anybody can actually put their hand up in this way or not, but
Yeah, I think you can. If you just hit the reactions, you can, and you can also type into the chat box. So far, no questions, so I think everyone is following along great.
Right. And if you do end up with questions and you can actually type them into the chat box, then that'll go onto our co-host and they can pass them on to me when we do stop for questions or interrupt as we go.
Yeah, I think both you and I can see in the chat.
Oh, I don't actually see a chat anywhere, but that's okay.
Oh, okay, perfect. That's fine. I'll read them out at the end.
Back into me if I did. All right, so now
We do have,
okay.
sorry, just someone just typed in. They're wondering about what triggers those things. Do you want to be a little bit more specific in terms of the question? Like, I think they're asking like what, why would being scared of a spider trigger? Like what?
Why become afraid of a spider in the first place?
Yeah.
Okay, so why be afraid of a spider in the first place? Again, that's going to be one of those things that either you're born with or that you evolve through experience. For example, I used to have arachnophobia. My body still has arachnophobia as an adult. And by that, what I mean is it will still react with an elevated heart rate, with increased levels of noradrenaline and norepinephrine when I've got a spider near me, even though I have a pet tarantula. But the reason that I'm afraid of a spider is when I was 5, I used to live in the Caribbean, and it used to rain a lot. And over there, they got some really big, animals. Obviously not that big, but of course, that's just what my brain kind of said was like, not that big. Now, I know it wasn't, but as a 5-year-old, I went into the garage one day, and I decided to put on my dad's big rubber boots. And as I'm stomping around in these big rubber boots in the garage, suddenly I feel something crawling on my foot. And my little 5-year-old brain goes, "What is that?" And I freeze. And then something starts to keep crawling higher. up my foot, and I start freaking out. So I start, kicking this boot off. And of course, when you're in a panicky state, your muscles contract. So that means my feet went stiff, which made it harder to get the boots off. And so now I'm not able to get the boots off. And this spider is getting bounced around in my foot and keeping crawling up. And I just have a heart attack. I managed to kick the boot off. It hits the wall, bounces off, lands a couple of feet from me. And out of the boot comes this huge tarantula and comes running at me. In my brain, it was trying to eat me. It was trying to kill me. So I totally freaked out. And even though before that I didn't have an issue with spiders, I had an issue with spiders ever since that day. It wasn't something that continued to be an issue because as an adult, I made a point of exposing myself to spiders in order to not continue to be afraid of spiders and to have this as an issue. But for me, that was a learned experience. And oddly enough, on reflection now, I don't like rubber boots. I never wear them. And that's probably because rubber boots back then were something that, made spiders come and try and eat my leg. Now, were they actually involved with that? No. But up until this very moment, even though I've told this story many times, it never actually dawned on me that, I don't like rubber boots and I don't wear them. And it's probably because of that. Because otherwise, why not wear rubber boots? So it's likely that these types of things are because of experiences, and it's the perception of the experience that is important, not the actual experience. And by that, what I mean is that perception of the danger. If I believe that there is something bad going on and my brain reacts with that dump of noradrenaline, that is going to be enough to trigger these avoidant reactions and responses. When my son was 6, we were out visiting grandparents. They'd gotten a new place. They were exploring the new house with his 2 sisters. And as they went into this one room, middle of the day, with his older sisters with him, wind from the open window on the ground floor caught the door and the door slammed shut. My son heard the sudden bang, got scared, ran for the door, tried to get it open. The handle was a little bit sticky. And from the house, we heard this blood-curdling scream of, "Ah!" And so we all ran down there, opened the door. It was maybe 30 seconds from the time the door slammed. But my son ran through the door, jumped in my arms, and he was convinced that he just about died and been locked in there forever. His 2 older sisters were with him, and they were telling him, "It's fine. Just give us a sec. We'll knock on the door. Dad will come. Grandma will come. Not going to be a big deal." But nope. In his mind, he just about died. And from that moment on, if there was a door that closed, he started to have a panic attack. And he got terrified of any door closing with him in an enclosed space. And that included things like the bathroom door, the shower door, the car door. So it hadn't been an issue to drive from the airport to my grandparents or to my parents' place. But the ride back was suddenly a very big deal because just to get in the car and close the door now was triggering panic attacks. So again, was there actually a dangerous thing there that most people would say was bad? No, not at all. But his perception of it was that it was very bad and dangerous. And that is what led to this intense, now fearful response and avoidant reaction that needed to be extinguished over time.
I think you answered that. The next question was, what causes excess harm avoidance, which I think you just explained very well. Another question.
And genetics is the main reason for it. In other words, if you have anxious parents, you're most likely to be anxious, and that temperament, that sensitivity of the brain to bad things, to overreaction, tends to come from a long genetic line of people that were very good at that and survived because they were always overly aware of danger in their environment.
What accounts for the relationship of the perceived spider size to the magnitude of the fear response experienced in the experiment?
Well, what accounts for it is perception. In other words, the more afraid I am, the more serotonin and noradrenaline gets dumped, and the more intense that feeling of fear, the bigger Bob perceives the danger to be. So it's just a perceptual misperception, but that is directly related to what we feel, because our feelings, our emotional experiences, emotions are just, at the end of the day, our conscious awareness of these messages from Jim and Bob. Jim and Bob tell us the stuff to want and the stuff to watch out for in two ways. They make us think things, so thoughts will pop into our head. You know, as you're sitting there watching a show or doing something, and suddenly your brain says, I want peanut butter. I got a peanut butter craving. Why? Well, that's because Jim suddenly said, peanut butter. Let's get some peanut butter. And sometimes you just get the first part of the message, not the second, which is, yeah, I want some. And it doesn't finish. And so you know you've got a craving for something, but you don't know what. And so you go to the fridge, you go to the pantry, you're looking through things, you're sampling things. Do I want a pickle? Do I want something salty? Do I want something sweet? Until eventually either you find it or you just give up because you don't know what you're craving. And yep, the craving's there. You know you want something, but you don't know exactly what it is. Or for Bob, you're just sitting there and suddenly the thought of, what if this happens, pops into your head. Or what if this happens? Why are you even thinking about that now? That's not even relevant to what's happening in the world or around you. Well, because if there's nothing else going on that I need to be analyzing right now, we can start going over these lists and, just keeping it fresh in our heads. So that is the thoughts. And then when Jim and Bob decide to take over control of the body, that is what we start to experience as emotions. And the more sudden and intense that emotion, the stronger that force, the more powerful Jim and Bob are, and that's reflected in the intensity of our feelings. So that's why the feeling is directly related to the perception of fear, is because they're kind of one and the same. Our experience of fear is why we misperceive things as being overly big. If we weren't afraid of it, we wouldn't be misperceiving it.
There's just one more question in regards to social anxiety. Someone commented that they struggle with the way people react when in a conversation. So they feel maybe constantly interrupted and they can't speak their mind to a current topic, and then they just shut down. So just in talking around the social anxiety piece that people struggle with.
Okay. And I'll talk about that shortly because it is relevant to the second part of the conversation. I can talk about it normally, but that isn't necessarily going to give us the answer that we want when it comes to how that manifests in an autism spectrum disorder, because it's actually a very different beast in an ASD most of the time. So we'll get to that shortly. So moving on, when we talk about autism spectrum disorders, this includes things like the social communication disorders, or high functioning autism, or Asperger's disorders, or people with a diagnosis of PDD, which in general, I'm going to refer to as neuroatypical individuals that encompass that whole category. The core feature with somebody that is neuroatypical, that makes them neuroatypical from birth, is that in their brains, the part of the brain and the genetics that are involved in the herding behavior of the species doesn't work so well. Now, herding behaviors or herding species are a species that collect in groups for safety, for functionality, and that as a result of this have to do certain things within that group. If you're in a group, you need to do things like communicate with other members of the group. You need to be able to understand communication of others in the group. You need to be able to send communication of others in the group. You need to be able to follow members of the group. You need to be able to do the things that the rest of the group is doing. You need to be able to identify the leadership of the group, know who the boss is and where you are in connection to that. So in other words, establish that social hierarchy. Because all of these things are important parts of the group. And again, these types of behaviors are things that we can do right away, very easily, right from birth, and animals can do this just as well. And they don't have any higher processing thinking. But if you have a cluster of dogs, you get, a pack of sheep, you get cows, you get horses, you get ducks, you get anybody in a group, then you're going to see these types of things right from birth. They know what a dog bark sounds like. If you have a cluster of puppies and they hear another puppy bark, they're all going to turn around and look to where it is and start heading over there. If they hear a cat meow or if they hear a parakeet chirp, they're not going to react in the same way because their brains are hardwired to understand and recognize the sounds that other members of their species make. They know what it means when one of their pack, tucks their tail between their legs and lays down. They know what it means when one of them growls at them and bares their fangs. They know what it means when one of them comes and pushes the other one over. And the alpha puppy in any litter is established within the first day. Everybody in that litter knows where they fall. And you can see it every time because the alpha is going to be the first one to go get food from mom, to nurse, to get anything that they want. And then the lesser ones, the betas, the gammas, the zetas, they all kind of trickle in afterwards. But that alpha puppy is the one that's going to lead the pack. And the alpha also comes after mom when they're puppies. But once he gets big enough, starts to be the leader of the pack, even though mom is still mom and mom is still the older one, because age isn't really the factor that determines alphaness. In terms of what does, we don't really know what genes do it, but we know that it's there and that it exists. And we know that if the alpha gets taken out, there isn't a huge battle for alphahood. People in a pack, animals know instinctively who's next in line. Who do we follow now? They understand their place in that hierarchy instinctively. And as humans, we're no different when our brains are neurotypical. Now, the second part of what makes an ASD is the sensory piece and sort of the cluster B symptoms, which for kids on the spectrum could be a sensory hyperreactivity in terms of a negative hyperreactivity. So that's when our brains react too strongly to sensory input and activate very unpleasant negative experiences as a result of it. So for example, fingernails on a chalkboard. All of you, I'm sure, know exactly what that sounds like and how it makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, how it makes your ears hurt, how it just sends like this shiver of unpleasantness through your body. For kids that are on the spectrum, that sensory hyperreactivity, the negative one, can be extremely intense and can be associated with a bunch of different sensory inputs, from tactile sensations to auditory sensations to taste sensations to smells to lights. They can have very, very intense physical responses of aversion, repulsion to things that would be otherwise normal for anybody else. Or it could be a positive hyperreactivity. It could be something that, when they experience it, brings a great deal of dopamine to the brain instead of serotonin or adrenaline. Therefore means something that they really like, something that they really seek out, something that they really want. And again, that can be tactile, visual, olfactory. You have these kids constantly chasing to go look at things, to touch things, to smell things, to lick things, to taste things, things that don't make any sense to be things that should release dopamine, but for them are very pleasurable and something that they will seek out preferentially over other things. I've got a little nephew, loves watching marbles on a tile floor. You spin a marble on the floor and he is good for the next 3 hours. He would take that over any video game any day. And for his mom, that's a problem because he's got a huge bag of marbles. And if those marbles are there, nothing gets done because he'll just sit in his room all day just spinning a marble over and over. And mom can try to use other things to try and lure him out, to get him to do things. But for him, this is all the dopamine I need. And if our brain is getting dopamine, our brain doesn't need anything else because dopamine is what allows us to survive. At least that's what our brain thinks. Because remember, biologically, dopamine is food, water, warmth. But when other things cause that same level of dopamine, our brain forgets to do things that it should be doing, like eating, drinking, staying warm. Because of the amount of dopamine that's released by other things, our brains aren't even aware that there's a lack of these things in our environment that we should be reacting to or responding to. The other thing that can happen with the sensory inputs, which isn't really a hyperreactivity, is absence. And in kids that are on the spectrum, that are neuroatypical, sometimes what you see is an absence of sensory reactivity, a lack of awareness of things that the body should be noticing, a lack of ability to smell things, to taste things, to experience temperature, to experience pain, to do various things. My nephew, as a teenager, I'd ask him various questions, and he told me one day, he goes, "Oh, that smells like breakfast." I said, "What do you mean it smells like breakfast? It's dinner." He goes, "No, but it smells like breakfast." I said, "Well, it's because it's sausage." He's like, "Yeah." I said, "So what's your point?" He goes, "Oh, it's nothing. It's just one of my favorite smells." I said, "What are your other favorite smells?" He goes, "Well, there's only three. There's breakfast, lunch, dinner. Oh, and there's yuck." I'm like, "You have three smells?" He goes, "Oh, sometimes there's a dessert smell." But to him, there's breakfast, lunch, dinner smells, dessert, and yuck. And if you've got something in one of those categories and you mix it up, it tastes the same. To him, a lemon meringue pie smells the same as a pumpkin pie, smells the same as a chocolate bar, smells the same as a thing. And he can't distinguish them if his eyes are closed. You give him a potato, a tomato, an onion, celery, all of those are in his yuck pile, and they all smell exactly the same. Cereal smells the same as bacon because it's a breakfast. And again, these are things that, as somebody that's neurotypical, you wonder, how is that possible? How do you get that? But neuroatypical kids have very abnormal wiring when it comes to these sensory processes. And it can be very abnormal to the point where they may not feel any pain. I've had kids that walked around on broken legs for a week before they bothered to go get x-rayed, because even though there was a very clear injury, they never bothered to tell anybody, and they never really complained until parents were like, "You're really not walking well on that," or "You're not using your hand anymore. Why not?" And then they go get x-rayed and find out that it's been broken for a while. Or temperature. These kids can sometimes be outdoors in the winter in shorts, t-shirt, barefoot, and they don't get cold. They don't feel cold, and they won't come in because they're freezing. And they don't even react cold. In other words, you don't see them shivering and going through the necessary physical responses of this. My nephew, he is literally out in the summer with a hoodie, sweater on, in long track pants, in 35, 40-degree weather, but he's not sweating. He's not dripping sweat like everybody else around him. And to him, he's perfectly comfortable. Doesn't bother him one bit to be like that. So back onto the social hierarchy, because this is an important concept to understand in neuroatypical kids. The social hierarchy is essentially that ladder of command. Who is above you? Who is below you? Because when somebody is above you, you listen to them. You do what they tell you to do. You trust them, you follow them. Without question, it's part of what our brains are hardwired to do. If the alpha sheep says we're moving this way, the rest of the herd just goes along. It doesn't question or challenge and say why. If the alpha says so, it's for a good reason, and you trust what the alpha says and does. And throughout our world, in just about every area, a social hierarchy exists. Anytime there is more than one person in a room with somebody else, and they are neurotypical, it'll be very quickly who is the boss, who is going to outrank who is going to be the one that gets to make the final decision, or in any disagreement is going to get their way at the end of the day. Because one of you is going to be willing to sit there and say, "You know what, that's fine, you do it. We'll do with what you want. It's not worth the fight. It's not worth the hassle." And for the one that says that, it's clear they're not going to be the boss. They're not the alpha of that situation. And understanding where you fall on that social hierarchy is very important, but it's something that kids who are neuroatypical don't understand and can't do. For them, asking them, are you the leader? Are you a follower? It's kind of like asking them, are you mayonnaise or are you purple? What do you mean? Are you alpha? Are you beta? Are you zeta? Like, where do you fall on that? They don't even understand that concept. And this is why you often see kids on the spectrum having so much difficulty with authority, with listening to parents, doing what parents tell them to do, doing what adults tell them to do, and interacting with adults as though they are on par with them, as though they are peers and equivalent, because in their minds, they are. Not that they perceive themselves to be above the hierarchy and at the same level as the adults or the authorities, but because in their minds, there is no hierarchy. There is no social structure that makes any one person more reliable, more important, that makes what they have to say more valuable than what anybody else has to say. And as a result, they don't filter information based on that hierarchy. You know, if your 2-year-old tells you something, and then your boss tells you something, and the doctor tells you something, you're going to listen to the person that you perceive to be the authority on this, the one that you know has the most knowledge with regards to this. And you're going to trust them. For somebody that is neuroatypical, that doesn't happen. They will listen to the first source of information as being the most valid one. And anybody that comes after that, if it's in conflict with that one, well, forget it. It doesn't matter if you are the expert, doesn't matter if you're the adult. If this is what my friend said, then this is what I believe is true. Because if it's not something that can be proven, then, you know, this is the best thing, or this is what we're going to do, or this is what I'm going to believe. You know, my teacher said to do it this way. Well, yeah, but you could do it this way. No, my teacher said to do it this way. Yeah, but she doesn't understand these things the way I do because, you know, I'm a mathematician, I'm a physicist. Nope, this is the way I have to do it. This is what they said was the way to do it. So not going to go any other way. Now, normally in neurotypical kids, Jim reacts to social interactions and social functions with pleasure. Being around people, being with people releases dopamine. It is something that we like, that we seek out, that makes our brains happy. And also moving up in that social hierarchy is also something we like. Being able to elevate our status is something that we seek. Normally, Bob reacts to things like being alone. Bob does not like being alone. Being alone is a dangerous thing. And for a herding species, it is absolutely biologically true. Being alone means you are the one that's going to get eaten by the wolf. You are going to be the one that gets picked off because you don't have the protection of the pack. And so Bob really doesn't like being alone. But Bob also knows that people can be dangerous, that people could be bad, could hurt you, you know, especially if you're not the alpha and not that strong. Bob doesn't want to get hurt either. So Bob is also usually quite afraid of groups. But Bob also doesn't like the idea of moving down in that social hierarchy. You know, being looked down upon, being judged badly by others. Really doesn't like it. Jim likes being judged positively by others. With neuroatypical kids, you don't see this. They don't get pleasure from being around people, from being with people. They get pleasure from doing stuff with people or without people. That doesn't really matter if people are there or not. It's about the activity, not the person or the individual. And as they get older, they start to understand that, oh, people judge. And they don't like that. They don't like the idea that anybody's going to try and determine where they belong, because in their mind, they're the only ones who can do that. So they have a very strong aversion to being judged, including positively. Even if it's a positive judgment from others, nope, don't you dare do that. Negative, doesn't matter. Positive or negative, I don't want it. And so you end up with a different manifestation of social interactions when you lack that awareness of that social hierarchy and that automatic activation of dopamine because of people in your environment. One of the other things that happens as a result of being part of a group is learning. In humans and in any herding species, there is a set of neurons in the brain called mirror neurons. And these neurons are specifically designed to help us mimic what we see, to mimic what others do, and to make us repeat those actions, repeat these things that we experience from others. This is, at its core, how we learn language. We speak the language that we hear being spoken around us. We mimic the mouth movements that we see other people do. We learn to try to make the sounds in the same way that other people make the sounds. We listen to that feedback, and our brains are constantly trying to make us match the people around us in every way, to do the things that other people do, to copy, if you will, automatically. In neuroatypical children, there is a significant decrease in the number of mirror neurons present. And to the degree that there is a decrease, you see very similar correlated deficits. Longer time to learn language when there are very few mirror neurons. Some kids on the spectrum may not talk until they're 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, or sometimes ever. Sometimes they talk very early, but they still don't know how to mimic, how to do the things that other people do, how to copy behaviors. And we teach as adults normally by having people watch us. We expect that this is how they're going to learn. And so we try to teach them these skills, and we all know the importance of setting a good example. Because we know that if we show these behaviors, they will learn these things. This is common knowledge. This is age-old wisdom. You set the example, your children, the youth of the world will mimic and copy and do what you do. If they're neurotypical. If they're neuroatypical, that isn't a given. As a matter of fact, it's unlikely. So for kids on the spectrum, it's not monkey see, monkey do. It's, oh, look, it's a monkey. What does that have to do with me? Nothing. So I don't learn from other people. Now, this plays a role because learning isn't just about what we do. It's also about the environment. We learn about what's dangerous by watching what has been bad to others in our environment that are like us. So if a wolf attacks a sheep and that sheep is the same as me and I know it could have been me, I'm going to stay away from wolves because even though it didn't hurt me directly, it hurt somebody exactly like me, which means it could have been me. And so I know I need to watch out for that. Equally, if my buddy here is chewing on a red berry and is eating it and he's fine and healthy and he's been in the pack for a while and he hasn't died, well, obviously that berry is good and healthy to eat, so I'm going to eat it too. And I'm going to rest assured it's not going to hurt me. That doesn't get translated into neuroatypical kids. Just because you aren't afraid of something or you tell me it's safe or I see you do it does not mean anything to me. It doesn't mean it's safe. It doesn't mean I can do it. It means that you did it, but what does that have to do with me? Now, talking about communication, because this is a very big one with kids on the spectrum, communication is how we interact with others of our group. And communication comes in multiple different formats. It comes in verbal, so words. It comes in nonverbal, which includes body language, gestures, movements, facial expressions, tone of voice, inflection, volume. And within all of those constructs, you also have timing, intonation, things that are considered the pragmatics of language. And within that, you have messages that are hidden within the message. They're based on similarity and awareness of other factors to send messages, what we call implied information or inferred information, where the message is not in the words that we say, or necessarily even in the body language. It's just, you should know what I'm talking about because, you know, that's what we're talking about. And if we are in the same group and we understand each other, then when I say, you know, you know. And you know what I'm talking about because you know. Kids who are neuroatypical don't know, and they don't understand what is implied, what is inferred. They don't hear the pragmatic differences. They don't use the verbal punctuation of life. They don't often pay attention to the body language of others, unless it's extreme. Most often, especially when we're talking about higher functioning kids, they understand words. They understand what you said exactly. But beyond that, it's very much hit or miss. The problem, though, is that they don't know if they're actually not understanding it correctly. In their minds, I heard something, I understood a message, that's the only message there was. I get it, I'm right. But that may not at all have been the message that was intended. And unfortunately, communication is a two-way street. There is a message that is being sent. There's a message that is being received. The goal and the hope in effective communication is that the message that was sent is the same as the one that was received. That may not happen where you may send a message, except that's not at all what they understood. They understood something completely different. But if they don't double check, if you don't double check, they're off acting based on this other message that they thought they got and reacting to it, which may not at all be what happened around them. So thinking of it like punctuation, it's essentially the difference between saying, let's eat, Grandma, and saying, let's eat, Grandma. Totally different meanings there. And whether you agree to that or not depends on what you believe the meaning to be. The words are the same. The inflection, the intention is very, very different. When you tell a kid, you know what, we're going to have some linguine tonight. And they're like, I don't like linguine. And you tell them, you like spaghetti. It's the same thing as spaghetti. Linguine is just the same thing as spaghetti. And they don't buy it. They're like, no, it's not. Yeah, it is. It's exactly the same as you always have. Now, is linguine actually spaghetti? No. Spaghetti's round, linguine's flat. Does that actually make a difference? Well, unless you've grown up in Italy and you understand the differences in how the noodle coats the sauce and the way the sauce to noodle ratio affects the different flavor transitions, it tastes basically exactly the same. It doesn't matter what the shape of the noodle is, it tastes the same. And that's usually what we mean when we tell them it's the same thing. But in their minds, they're not picking up on that implied information of the flavor. The way it tastes is the same. All they're hearing is, you're telling me that round is the same as flat? You're crazy. That is not at all what is the same. You know, one of my favorite examples of this was a parent told his child, go to your room. I do not want to see you out of that room for the rest of the night. They were very upset at what they did. And the child understood this. And not 5 minutes later, a sheet walks down the hallway. And mom looks over at the sheet, and the sheet's clearly walking down the hallway and yells, what are you doing? And there's a dead quiet. And so mom says, I know you're under there. I told you to stay in your room. And the child says, no, you didn't. And mom's like, yeah, I did. I told you not to come out of your room. No, you didn't. You're lying. Now, did mom say not to come out of the room? No, mom said specifically, I don't want to see you out of your room for the rest of the night. There is an implied message there, but that was not what the child understood. In fact, the child was doing exactly what mom said, not letting mom see him coming out and believe that he was doing exactly what was asked because mom couldn't see him under the sheet. And that's all she said she wanted was to not see him. So he didn't at all understand why mom was getting upset even further and getting more angry at what he was doing because he didn't disobey mom. He did exactly what mom said. So this communication problem is a very, very common issue with neuroatypical children. And these are the kinds of things that happen. You know, if the bird's supposed to chill in the sink, let's let it chill in the sink. Now, in the nonverbal communication, body language is one of those things that kids on the spectrum struggle with. They struggle with understanding. What does it mean when you move your face that way? What does it mean when your eyes look that way? What does it mean that you react that way? And this is reflected in their difficulty with discerning and understanding emotions in others, understanding what do those things mean. You know, if we look at this person's eyes as adults, presumably neurotypical, it's obvious what is going on. We're not wondering, oh, are they jealous? Are they arrogant? Are they hateful? No, we know that they're panicked. It's obvious. We don't even have to try to think about it. Our brains just know this right from the get-go. Our brains have this dictionary that tells us, what does it look like if somebody's eyes are like that? And that's really all we need to be able to identify a lot of these things. I'm sure you've heard the saying, the eyes are the mirror to the soul. And it's because it's true. We can read so much from just looking at the eyes and nothing else. Neuroatypical kids don't get any information from the eyes. They don't understand how that is relevant to anything. This is often why eye contact just doesn't happen. Not because they're actively avoiding eye contact, which is sending a message to somebody that understands eye contact, but that's not their intention. They don't know what message is being sent by not making eye contact. They're not even aware of what message is sent when you're making eye contact. And unfortunately, because of non-verbal communication and the fact that it happens all the time, whether you know you're doing something or not, whether you understand the message you're sending or not, you are communicating with everything that you do. If I ask you a question and you don't answer me, that's sending a message to me. If you do answer me, that's sending a different message to me. If you answer me with this tone of voice or that tone of voice or no tone of voice, all of these things are sending a message that I am going to understand and interpret and react to. Whether you know you're doing it or not is irrelevant. I assume if you're human, you know the messages you're sending. But neuroatypical kids don't know those messages. They don't understand them. And it's why there's so much confusion and frustration when they're trying to figure out these messages around other people. What is it like to be a neuroatypical child? Well, that's easy. If I don't get messages, if I don't understand the facial expressions, then girl number one is angry and afraid and sad. And yep, that's what they look like when they're worried. And yep, that's what they look like when they're confused and when they're bored and when they're flirty and when they're uncomfortable and happy and guilty. And so if that is your dictionary of what do these things mean, if in your mind there are really very few actual facial expressions you can discern beyond the extremes, and everything in between is just a guessing game, then what do you do when you're approached by someone that's making this kind of a face to you? How do you react? What should you do? If they came up to you and looked at you, what's the right thing to say or do? And what, in terms of right thing, what's your goal? What is it that you're hoping is going to happen? Is your goal to make them happy with you? Is your goal to make them upset with you? Is your goal to get them to like you, to not like you? What are you going to do? And that is a challenge. And if you don't know what to do, if you don't even know what the goal is, if you don't even understand what the question is, how do you make the right choice about where to go from here? How do you make the right behavioral decision moving forward? In this picture, there is information. Information that is going to be obvious to the majority of you watching this. The majority of you can look at that and say, oh, that's a boat. If there are men here who are looking at this, there's a 5% chance that they won't see the boat because they're colorblind. This is a plate that is designed to assess color blindness. And if you are colorblind, you don't see the boat. No matter how hard you try, you're not going to see the boat because your brain just doesn't understand that wavelength of color that is red and green and can't discern between them. And you could want to, you could try to, but it doesn't matter. There are certain things your brain is simply going to be unable to do no matter what. Doesn't mean that you're dumb, doesn't mean that you can't do stuff like other people. Even though there's something that's really easy to be done by others, you may not be able to do it because of an information processing deficit that you have. And if you can't see the information contained within, how do you react to these things? How do you know what the instructions are in these various dots? If you can see it, you know exactly what they say. I haven't got a clue what that says. I don't even know if it's a word, a number, a picture, because I'm colorblind. And I've been staring at this particular one ever since my wife pulled it out for me last night. And I'm still trying to figure out what it is. And I haven't got a clue. My wife gave me a hint. She said it's a word. Okay, I'll take her word for it because she can see color. I can't. So I have no idea what message is being sent in that picture. She said, here's another one for you to use. And I said, okay, well, that's a nice one. And what does it mean? I don't know. It means I love you. That's my guess. Because it's got a great big heart, so I'm reading the information that I can perceive. Now, I'm sure it doesn't say that because she laughed. And based on her reaction, that was sending me a message that I could understand and could interpret and understood to mean, okay, so there's something else going on here. And my bet is there's something inside of that heart that says something other than that. Like maybe I don't love you, or I don't know. But I can't tell because I'm colorblind. And without relying on somebody that can see these colors to tell me this information, I'm going to base my reaction on what I see and what I can perceive. And it may be completely wrong. So I may approach somebody that shows me this and give them a hug and say, thank you. That is so nice, so sweet, so kind. And I might have them laugh like my wife did. I might have them repulsed. I don't know what they're going to react like because I don't actually know what message is there. But I'm aware that I can't see it. So I know that in this kind of a situation, I need to be careful about what judgments I make, what conclusions I jump to, because I can also understand what they think about. Kids that are neuroatypical can't do that other part, can't think about what other people think about and understand their frame of mind, their reference. So all they get is the information that they get, which may be partial, maybe incomplete, and then they act on that information, oblivious to what else may be going on. Now this is one that I picked out, and I did it as, revenge to my wife. I said, okay, well, can you read this one? Now, chances are that most of you are sitting there going, read what? Can you read the word that's on this one? Because there's a message in that one too. I can see it because it's a reverse plate. And that means that only colorblind people can read what's on that one. If you aren't colorblind, you have no idea what's on there because the information gets lost when you can see all the colors. If you can't see all the colors and your brain distorts things in a very predictable way, then it's easy to know what's said there. So when we talk about reactions in people and kids that are on the spectrum that are neuroatypical, we're basically talking about what's going on in their heads to make decisions. How are they coming to conclusions about what to do, how to react, how to behave? Not only in the automatic sense as a result of Jim and Bob, because Jim and Bob are also affected by this information processing deficit, but also by the higher order processing. The logic and reason part of the brain still doesn't have access to this information, so it's not something that they can just logic out sometimes. So how do you make a decision about what to do? Where do you go from here? What's going to be the right choice? How should you react to a situation? What's the outcome of that situation? And here comes problem number 3 with neuroatypical kids. Imagination. Imagination is our ability to create mental visual imagery of things that don't exist, things that we've never seen, never experienced, but can create in our heads and see and experience mentally. And we use imagination all the time. Every time we plan the future, every time we think about what's going to happen next, every time we decide, you know what, I think that's a good idea, or I think that's a bad idea. What our brains are doing is very quickly imagining the sequence of events, playing it through in our heads, seeing the end point, which is good, bad, or otherwise, thinking about, okay, would I like that? Would that be fun or not? Understanding what my reaction would be because I can imagine myself in that situation. I don't need to be there to know that I would react badly. And then deciding, you know what? Yeah, based on that, I'm not going to do that. In kids who are neuroatypical, what is commonly seen along with that neuroatypicality is a lack of imagination, a loss of the ability to create mental visual imagery. And this is something that not a lot of people are aware of and not a lot of people assess for or pay attention to, but it is a very, very important thing when we're talking about how are kids reacting, how are we going to help teach them and understand things. It's often reflected in the lack of imaginative play, in not knowing how to pretend things, not being able to imagine things being different. For kids with aphantasia, which is very commonly seen, not every kid on the spectrum has aphantasia. Some do have the ability to create mental visual imagery, but that lack of ability is very common in it and is something that should always be paid attention to. They see nothing. When you ask them to imagine something, they can't. And for a lot of kids, your first hint that this is the case is when they're growing up and they're learning to read. When we read, our brain takes the words on the page, turns it into a movie in our heads, and we watch that movie with our brains. And it's a fun movie, it's an interesting movie, it's an exciting movie, it's a scary movie, it's a sad movie. But that's what keeps us engaged. That's what keeps us going forward and liking reading, getting us to really enjoy it. If I can't imagine something, then that means that when I read stuff on a page, it's just words, a whole bunch of words stuck together. And I have no idea what's going on because there's so many words to keep track of that I can't do it. So when they start progressing into reading books without pictures to show them what's happening, they get lost very quickly. They develop a deep dislike for books because everybody says these are fun things to do or read, and they really don't understand why or how. And when people ask them simple things like what happened in the story, they have no idea. And if we were in the same boat, if we had to remember every word only and remember specific details without the pictures, we probably wouldn't have any idea either by page 4, because at that point you're already at 600 words and you're supposed to remember what happened in the first 100 words. Good luck. And I'm sure you've all heard the saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and that's probably much closer to being accurate. You know, as the words go, the picture gets evolved and developed, and all you need to do is remember that picture to know what's happening, to be able to anticipate, to predict, to understand, to see it happening in your eyes. If they have aphantasia, they can't do that. They can't invent stories. You tell them to do a creative writing task. You write about an activity, or imagine you went into your house and you saw a big box in the middle of the living room and something is moving inside the box. Write a story about what it is. They'll go, well, what is it? Well, you tell me. Well, I don't know. You didn't tell me. Why no? You have to imagine it. What? I don't understand. Imagine what's in the box. I don't know what's in the box. You didn't tell me. And we don't see the disconnect. And all we see is the behavioral aversion, the avoidance of something, because they can't do it. And we're asking them to do something that they just don't understand. This particular cartoon was made by somebody with aphantasia. And most people with aphantasia haven't got a clue what they can't do because it's never been something that they can do. And they're only now figuring it out when other people are talking about it, when other people mention it, when other people sit there and say, no, I can literally imagine that happening. They're like, not really. No, like I can see it. How? In my head. What do you mean? I can imagine you doing this very easily, but I've never done that. And then they start going, what are you talking about? there's a very interesting article online. If you're interested in this, or you think that it's something that your kids may have, if you Google the name Blake Ross is a Silicon Tech guru. He's the guy that developed the web browser Firefox, and very rich, very well known in the tech world, very brilliant guy with aphantasia. And he only figured out that he had aphantasia in his mid-30s as a result of reading an article about a guy who had a surgery, and after the surgery, because there was something that happened in the surgery, likely a tiny mini stroke in the brain, lost the ability to make images in his brain. And this was being reported as, wow, didn't even know that could happen. He read this article and thought, what? Lose what did they lose? What are they talking about? I don't understand. And he wrote a very long, detailed account of his journey to really understand this concept and how he got to that point and how he's gone through his life up to this point in time without having the ability to imagine things, without having any images in his head. And as an adult, because he's a very intelligent, well-spoken guy, he does a really good job of sort of describing what is life like without that ability to imagine stuff. And it can be very, very simple. From something as simple as, make a picture in your head of a red square, a green circle. Can you change the shape of the circle? Can you make it into a ball? Can you stretch it out, turn it into a brick? Can you suddenly see it morphing into a tree? Take something that you know and change it into something that you've never seen before. Can you imagine the room in this configuration, in that configuration? Can you imagine that couch moving through that door and see that it's not going to fit? Or do you have to try because your brain can't actually move it mentally in your head through that door without you moving it physically through the door right here, right now? So those are the factors that make an ASD an ASD. Now we're going to talk about behavior, behavioral inhibition, behavioral activation, and how does this interplay with anxiety in these situations, and how do you tell what's what? Most of the time, if we see somebody refusing to do something, we assume that it's because of anxiety. We assume that there is fear, that there is something that makes them not want to do it. Whether it's an animal, whether it's a person, you can see this happening all the time. And people and animals can be very determined in making sure that you don't make them do something that they really don't want to do. And it may very well be because of fear, but it might not be. It might be because of other factors too. If it's unreasonable fear, that's anxiety. But what if it's not that? What if it's not fear? What if it's something else? You can also have behavioral activation, which is going out of your way to do something. Why do you do things? Why do you go out of your way to change things? We all know what OCD is. We all know what it's like to see somebody that has to line things up, has to organize things, has to keep things closed. And everybody says, oh, they're a little bit OCD. OCD is when your brain tells you you have to do this or else something bad is going to happen if you don't. If you don't do this a certain number of times or in a certain way, it's going to be a bad outcome, and it's really not something you want to do. If you don't go check that lock 5 times, someone's going to break in and hurt you. If you don't go wash your hands this number of times, you're going to get germs and you're going to die. And so the behaviors are driven by anxiety, by fear of an outcome. Now, if you look at this dog, you're thinking it's a dog with OCD. But is it really? If you look at the dog's body language, this is not a dog that is scared. This is a dog that is having fun. This is a dog that is excited. He is wagging his tail. It's a fun wag. And what's he doing? He's closing all the drawers, closing all the cupboards, something that his master has obviously trained him to do, I guarantee it, and trained him through treats. So he's expecting that if I do all this stuff, I'm going to get me a treat. So he can go and do this easily, looking very much like an OCD type of scenario, but not because of OCD, but because of the pleasure that it's going to bring him right afterwards as a result of the contingencies that are there. So when you look at behaviors, whether it's activation or inhibition, you need to pay attention to what is driving it. And you need to think beyond just what is obvious. It could be gym that is making them do this. It could be because it's something that their brains like that are releasing dopamine in their brains. And I'll give you an example of that.
Exercises to help with your compulsive need for closure.
Well, I take issue with the word compulsive.
All I'm saying is we live in a world where closure isn't always an option.
Shun. Okay. For the sake of argument, let's say I have a problem. What would be your plan for addressing it?
I'm going to recondition your brain so that the need for completion isn't so overwhelming.
By playing tic-tac-toe.
Yep, your turn.
Oh, Amy. And you wonder why people think neuroscience is nothing but a goofy game for diaper babies. Tic-tac-toe can only end in win, lose, or draw, none of which will deny me closure. Especially since I'm about to win. Well, we didn't finish.
Exactly. How does that make you feel?
The same way any normal person would. Like I want to peel off my own face and tear it in two, and then again and again, till like a handful of Sheldon face confetti.
And that's exactly the feeling we want to address with this course of treatment.
Yeah. Or you could pitch in, grab a nostril, and help me get this face off.
Come on, you can do this.
Okay, well, you don't know what it's like to feel completely frustrated. And to have a desire build up within you and then be denied any opportunity for release.
Yeah, sounds like a drag. For the land of the free and the home of the next. It's quite an impressive layout, isn't it?
Yes.
Let's box it up.
It's back to that.
That's enough. Sheldon, get it! Okay, Sheldon, make a wish and blow out the candles. Oops, missed one. Now your wish can't come true.
Lucky for you, because I wished you were dead. I must say, I was skeptical at first, but this has truly been a transformative evening.
I'm a little surprised to hear you feeling so positive.
Well, you're an excellent neuroscientist, you're a wonderful girlfriend, and... Doesn't matter, does it?
I'm proud of you, Sheldon.
And a complete sucker. Oh, yeah. There he is. And the home of the brave. Don't stop. Yes. Keep going. Just like that. Almost there. Almost there.
Sheldon, you big weirdo, I want you to know that I love that you're in my life.
I love you too.
I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Big Bang Theory. Sheldon Cooper is one of the popular poster children for high functioning autism or social communication issues, though he's never actually formally labeled as such in the show. The views are obvious, and they've actually done a very good job of highlighting a lot of what you do see in the real world. Now, Sheldon has this need for completion, this need for things to be a certain way, which could be considered obsessive compulsive, having to do things until they're finished. But if you pay attention to what he is doing, what he's saying, he is not talking about a fear of what happens if it doesn't get done. He's talking about a desire to see the completion and experiences pleasure at getting it finally done, and frustration and anger if something gets in his way of getting it finished, which is clearly not Bob that is controlling that behavior. That is Jim that needs to get these things done, wants to get these things done, has to have things this way because that's what Jim wants. That's what gives his brain dopamine. And whether we understand why or not doesn't matter. That is clearly a Jim-driven behavior. Now, the reason that it is important to understand whether this comes from Jim or whether this comes from Bob is that when we pit Jim against Bob, if we try to change our child's motivation around doing something, get them to do something that is different than what they are doing, Jim will always override Bob at the end of the day. The fear can always happen first, fastest, but the desire will always last longest and become strongest. So if you think that there is something that your child is doing because they really, really love it, or you understand that it's something that they love, having consequences or negative things that are going to happen because they're doing this isn't going to be effective. Because when they are chasing the dopamine, trying to activate the noradrenaline, the serotonin, trying to get Bob on board to scare them into doing something that they shouldn't be doing or should be doing, isn't going to work. When you've got a Jim-based problem, the only thing that is going to work is another bigger, louder, stronger Jim. You need to use a drive to fight a drive, especially when they're younger. And that means you need to have control over a larger source of dopamine, something they like even more than that other thing, to use as a lure to get them to stop this other behavior that they like. Now, sometimes it's not Jim, it is legitimately Bob. And another example of that would be this one here.
One, two, three, four, five. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Hot. Hot.
Now, if you've ever seen that particular movie with Jack Nicholson, it's an excellent depiction of somebody with OCD, the classic, the typical OCD. And in just that little clip itself, you can see the difference between the manifestation of needing to do things a certain way, a certain number of times, because what this person is doing it this way, even though it's either unpleasant, even though it's burning him, even though the water hurts. The problem is he's more afraid of what's going to happen if he doesn't do it this way. And so, yes, he will make himself experience unpleasantness in order to avoid a bigger unpleasantness. He's so afraid of germs that if I have to burn myself, that's okay, because it means I'll avoid dying. And when Bob is driving the behavior, the problem is that usually Bob, his perception of the bad that's going to happen if they don't do these things is excessive and excessively huge. And again, if you try to use typical parenting strategies to get kids to stop doing something, and it is a Bob-driven behavior, again, the typical parenting strategy is consequences. If you don't do the things the way I want you to, if you don't listen and obey, there will be a punishment or something bad is going to happen to you that I'm going to make happen. I'm going to yell, I'm going to scream, I'm going to consequence, I'm going to ground, I'm going to do something you're not going to like. The problem with doing that way is that if they are more afraid of the consequence in their head of the bad thing, unless the thing that you are threatening them with is much worse than that, they will not care. They will not change what they do. They will go through that unpleasantness because they're too afraid not to. And it's not going to make any difference. It's just going to make it more unpleasant because you just added to the unpleasantness of the whole experience. In other words, you can't scare a kid out of being scared. It doesn't work. So again, understanding that you have to use the drive to fight a drive. This is another reason why finding rewards, using gym, activating gym becomes so important a strategy in these kids that it needs to become the default parenting style because it makes life so much easier for you as a parent and for them and helps them get past a lot of these very difficult things that they struggle with. Now, the other reason that somebody may not act one way or may act a different way is this, which is what you see right now. Now, if this was what was facing you, how are you going to react to it? By the way, this is a much easier thing to do when there's actually interaction and people, which I know, given the video, isn't really a feasible option. But when you look at this, what's it going to make you do? For most of you, you're sitting there probably thinking, I don't see anything. What are you talking about? Thinking there's something wrong with the slide, something wrong with the presentation. There isn't. I'm just asking you to make the decision to choose a course of action based on no information, based on a complete absence of information about what we're talking about. This is the child with aphantasia. When you are asking them to do something that they've never done, that they don't understand, that you're trying to explain something to them, strategies, get them to do it. What are you talking about? They don't get it. And if they don't get it and they don't have the information, how can they make a decision? And for kids with aphantasia, you see a very strong insistence on routine, on doing things where I don't have to rely on imagination. I can rely on memory of what's going to happen, of consequences. I know that if I do things exactly this way, like I did yesterday, and I remember what I did yesterday, it's going to be the same outcome. So I don't even have to try to figure out what the outcome is. If this was a good way to do it, we're going to continue to do it exactly in this way. And if you as a parent say, hey, let's do it a little bit differently. Why don't we just change this up a bit? It's not a big deal just to do it a little bit differently. You know, we'll go here instead of here. Why don't you sit on this spot instead? Why don't we go this way to school? Now you get the behavioral avoidance of no. Why not? Because that's not the way it is. That's not what my memory tells me is going to be okay. And as a parent, you try to reassure, you try to convince them, you try to explain, this isn't a big deal. This is just a little variant. It really isn't going to affect anything. But for them, it affects everything because they can't see whether or not it's a relevant detail, whether or not it's going to change anything. They can't go through that process or even follow it along with you. So when you try to get them to do something new, all you're getting is this still. Nothing I don't know. I want it to be exactly the same. Now, is that because I'm afraid? Not entirely. There is a natural aversion to not knowing, but it's not the same thing as fear in the sense of activation of noradrenaline and serotonin. It's more like the absence of any positive or negative. And that is something that, as neurotypical people, we rarely actually experience because our lives are constantly being affected by things around us, by people around us. There's a constant flow of noradrenaline, of dopamine, of serotonin interplaying in our brains. For neuroatypical kids, quite often you see very little activation of emotion, of messaging, of motivation, of things, very little reactivity to things because they don't experience that regularly. A lot of times they just have a neutral response, and that neutral response means they don't do anything. The default is not to do something, not because I'm afraid, but because my brain isn't saying yay or nay, it's saying, who cares? Now, normally, social influences come into play, which is, I care. I'm the adult, listen to me. But if they don't understand that social hierarchy and they don't follow the rules of social hierarchy, then that's an irrelevant piece of information too. So just because you said to do it doesn't mean a thing. That doesn't influence this in any way, shape, or form. So it still doesn't move them. So they end up in a state of stagnation where they don't move and they may not make decisions and they may not do things or go places. They may not want to change anything, not because of fear, but because of neutrality, because of the lack of direction from their brain about what to do, where to go, how to react. This is very important when we talk about treatment because at a neurobiological level, anxiety responds to anxiolytic medication. Neutrality, avoidance, or behavioral lack of activation does not respond to that. And if we think that they have anxiety and we put them on an anxiolytic and we don't see the results we want, it may be because it's not actually anxiety. And we may be chasing our tails trying to find the right cocktail when the cocktail isn't actually the problem. Now, a lot of times we can see movement sometimes with unexpected things when we see kids with anxiety or we see kids that have problems with motivation. Kids that are neurotypical often end up on stimulants and often get assigned the label of ADHD because they typically don't follow through with recommendations. They don't do what we ask them to do. They don't follow these things. They don't pay attention to us. Not because they can't pay attention, because if it's something that they like, boy, do they ever pay attention to that a lot, probably way too much. And they can be very focused and fixated and very detail oriented, but they still get said to have ADHD. And they use the old version of hyperfocus, which is not really something that you see in ADHD, but historically when there wasn't as much of an awareness of the spectrum and the milder versions of it, people often got misdiagnosed when they should have been diagnosed as Asperger's as called ADHD. So we did see in the population of ADHD, there was a group that had this really great focus in certain areas. We also had the ADHD kids that did not have that. But if you actually look at kids that have done studies recently, when we are much better at making the distinction and the diagnosis, you don't see the same split in terms of hyperfocus as being a common feature of ADHD, but it is absolutely a very common feature of high-functioning kids. Now, having said that, the myth got perpetuated because you put kids who are on the spectrum on a stimulant, and it makes a difference. They do function better. They do start to work better, focus better, get more work done, do things in a more appropriate way, which makes it seem like it's working. But what stimulant medications do is they artificially boost dopamine. So they essentially make the brain think that the brain likes whatever it's doing at the time, kind of like if it was one of their natural interests. And that could be whether they're cleaning, whether they're reading, whether they're doing math homework. So there isn't a lack of a message anymore. There is a message, but it's artificially coming in from the outside. It's coming from medication. Because instead of blocking effects that are supposed to be overstimulated like SSRIs do, it adds something to the mix. And that added message is what would be a normal message for somebody that's motivated to do these things. So it brings them back up to a more normal interactive signaling stage in their brain, which allows them to then do things, pay attention, and get things done. Now, this question sometimes comes up, which is, am I saying that they shouldn't be on stimulants? Not at all. We use medication to treat symptom clusters. If there is a problem symptom that is out there and we have a medication that can treat it, and it's being taken and it's working and it's not causing side effects, it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. In psychiatry, we invented the diagnostic labels for the representation of the neurochemical imbalances. Medications affect the neurochemical imbalances. Medications don't care what we call it. So it's important not to get confused by the label of something versus is medication helpful or not, and to look at that as a completely separate issue. So what do we do then if we have behavioral inhibition or behavioral activation that we see that we would like to address? Whether it's anxiety-based or not, whether it's driven by Jim, whether it's driven by Bob, we need to be able to focus on the behavior and to get them to do the things that they need to do, or stop doing the things that they're doing that are inappropriate that we presume to be as a result of anxiety, or now that we know more, as a result of Jim. And the only way to effectively do that behaviorally is to use rewards, to use Jim to fight either Jim or Bob. When it is anxiety in and of itself, and we know it's anxiety, and there's no question that it is absolutely Bob driving this. Anxiety activates quickly, strongly, but has no staying power. So when it turns on right away. If I'm going to get scared of something, I'm going to get scared of it as soon as I see it. And so that leads to behavioral inhibition. Now, if I bring out a goodie, if I activate Jim at the same time, Jim doesn't activate as quickly as Bob does. So in the short run, anxiety will still win. But if you wait it out, if you take the time to wait it out, Bob activates quickly but gets exhausted, wears itself out, and eventually hits a plateau where it can't activate anymore because it's in a refractory period. Where because it dumped all of the noradrenaline and serotonin into the synaptic cleft, that needs to get recycled, brought back up to the top before it can be dumped again. And when it's not in the synaptic cleft, the activation of that behavioral response is gone. Dopamine, on the other hand, starts out high when you've got what you want, and then once you don't have what you want and you want it, it drops. And the longer you wait, the more it drops. And the lower it gets, the more intense the behavioral activation. And that means that eventually, if you start out here with fear and you start out here with desire and you just sit and wait, you will eventually hit a point where desire becomes more important than fear. And suddenly the thing that they were not going to do because they were scared to do it is going to be something that they are willing to do and go and do happily because it's going to get them what they want. And more importantly than that, if you link that reward, that positive experience right away to them after they do the thing that they were technically afraid of doing, their brain learns that doing this got me what I want, which means that behavior is going to be reinforced, it's going to happen more often, and it's going to become something that they stop being afraid of altogether because it's now a good thing. Now, you could do it in the old-fashioned way, which is just to gradually expose them to it in the hopes that eventually they'll get over it and conquer that fear, that anxiety. But that means they have to want to do it. Because if we're forcing them into exposure, that's not the same thing as them choosing to expose themselves, choosing to conquer that fear themselves through exposure. That's just them being more afraid of us. And as soon as we stop pushing them, they're going to stop doing it because we're not there to scare them into it anymore. But that takes a long time, even when they decide to do it and they push themselves. A lot of repetition goes into conquering a fear, a lot of time, because even though it may not actually be a bad situation, nothing bad may actually happen. The problem is because I'm scared, that's bad in and of itself. I don't like being scared. So it is a negative experience as soon as I try to push myself to stop being afraid of something. Using rewards can outright eliminate that fear. And if you want to see this in action, again, if you go to my website, there's a video in the presentation section that's labeled Conquering a Phobia in an Hour, which is a live interactive session of me with a real patient with a very real needle phobia who was not ever going to get a needle again in her life ever, and who had not gotten a needle in a decade and was terrified of them, and how using exactly this strategy, just using a reward, activating the fear and waiting, at the end of that period of time, she is choosing to give herself a needle and to let me give her a needle without it being a bad thing for her, without fighting, without problems. Did it take an hour? Yes, it did, because I had to wait for it to get down there. Will it ever take more than an hour, hour and a half? No. It will always be something that you can get by that time. So if there is very real fear, anxious avoidance of something, and you need them to get past it, use rewards and find a day where you can literally just sit and wait for an hour, and you trigger that fear, and you use the reward, and you wait. Because they will eventually get to the point where they're like, okay, let's do this. And you always want to wait for them to tell you that that's the case, because when that happens, that's when you know there's more dopamine in their brain now than noradrenaline, which means it's going to be a positively reinforced experience, not a negatively reinforced one, which is exactly what we need to achieve. But we need to wait for them to get to that point and tell us by their behavior, because you're going to see a shift in their behavior, and it's going to stop being about avoidance, and they're going to start paying more attention to the reward. They're going to start wanting it more, and then they're going to get it. But to get them there, to use that reward effectively, they need to just be sitting and waiting. Because dopamine is dopamine. Doesn't matter what the reward is. If I like it, if it releases dopamine in my brain, that's all I care about. Absence of dopamine is what drives that power. If I'm getting fun activation from another source while I'm waiting, my dopamine level, or the need for it, is never dropping to a point where it's going to be relevant. So I need to be sitting there faced with the decision of, am I going to do this or not? If I do, I get this. If I don't, then that's fine. But we're going to sit here for the next hour and a half and wait. And I'm going to keep asking you, do you want to do this yet? And if not, we'll wait. And that's all you're doing, is asking and waiting. And you will get them there. If it's Jim that's fighting it and it's not anxiety, now the problem is the same. Only Jim is going to be able to outrank Jim. So you need to use a bigger reward than what they've got access to currently. And this can sometimes be a challenge in kids that are neuroatypical, because their things that they like, the things that activate that dopamine in their brain, can be something that you can't actually control. This is where they get into the self-stim behaviors, where they do things with movements, with motion, with tactile sensations, that to them, they could do this for hours and be 100% happy. And if you can't actually control their access to their fingers, their access to sounds, then it makes it much more challenging to find a reward that is going to override that. But if you can, that's where you want to go. A lot of times, though, they're fixations. If it's an interest, that tells you that that's a very dopaminergic thing for them. And if you can control access to those interests, then you will have control over one of the most powerful motivators for them, making it such that they will be far more willing to do the things, to learn the activities that they need to learn.
We have a couple of questions here, and I think you may have answered them, but how do you help a child who has constant or severe anxiety, which I think you kind of explained there. Also, let's see. Can you provide an example where a caregiver activates a pleasure-seeking drive to overwhelm or improve an automatic fear response or avoidant behavior? And then also another question is, if you're a family that maybe has financial difficulties in terms of providing rewards, what could be some other options?
Okay. So in terms of examples, like I said, if you go to that video, you'll see the example of the reward for this girl. The reward was money and, more importantly, fame. Part of the thing that she really wanted was to be a YouTube star. Mom told me this beforehand. I needed to know what she wanted in order to be able to use it to activate it. So I let her know, by the way, this is being videoed. This will be posted on YouTube. You could become famous because of this. And that was a very powerful motivator for her to make her decide to go, okay, maybe. And to get there in combination with the financial reward. On a more personal level, for my son, the way we got him past this fear of doors, and most importantly and specifically car doors, because having him have a panic attack every time we closed the door to go anywhere was simply not a feasible option, and it was a flat out panic attack, was to use the Nintendo DS. And back in that time, it was the new Mario Brothers game that he loved. And so I got the DS, I bought it, I put it in the car, and I explained to him, you can play the DS once you're in the car and the door is closed. You decide when you close the door. No one's going to close it on you. But once you close the door, you can play it on the DS. And he would jump in the car, and you'd see him sitting there, and he'd start to get panicky, but he'd look at the DS, and he'd hear the game intro sound, and he'd see the video, and he'd really, really, really want to play it. And slowly the hand would go, and it'd sit on the door, and he'd wait, and he'd be watching the DS, and he'd wait, and then he'd be ready to go, and then he'd quickly close the door, and then take the DS, and then focus on that. And doing that, it took about a week before he didn't even care if the door was closed or not. As a matter of fact, he would sometimes go out to the car specifically to play on the DS because the DS was only ever in the car with the door closed. And he started asking, can I go to the car to play on the DS? I said, sure, as long as the doors are closed. Because this was telling me, okay, you know what? He's over that now. We can now drive, we can do things without him getting all panicky because of the DS. If it wasn't for the DS, something that I knew he liked, and I was just trying to force him into it, it would have been months and months and months of panic, if ever, to get him to stop being afraid of being in the car. So those are very concrete examples. It doesn't need to be something like the DS. It doesn't need to be money. It just needs to be something that they want, that they like. So something that releases dopamine in the brain that they don't have yet. So that's how they want it. You can't want what you already have. And for that reason, it's important to understand the distinction between, if you don't do this, then I'm going to take away your phone. That's a consequence. That is a threat of a bad thing happening if it's already in their hands. If it is not in their hands yet, it is not something that they have, that they see as theirs, that they control, it is your phone. Then it becomes, if you do this, you get to use my phone afterwards. Now, obviously, it goes without saying, if you don't do this, you don't get to use my phone. But that's not what we're focusing on. We're focusing on the fact that if you want this, you can do this. You can get this. All you need to do is this. And we can wait until you do. And it is up to you whether you do or not. But if you do, you'll get this. And I know you like this. And I know you want this. And I'm going to keep this in front of you. And it's going to be real. It's going to be tangible. And it's going to be visible. Because if you've got a child with aphantasia, they can't imagine that reward. They need to see it right in front of them for it to activate that drive. For them to have Jim activated, it needs to be real right in front of them, not down the road, not imagined, but very real. And you need to have a tangible representation of it. Now, if the reward is not a thing, it's an activity. It's going fishing. It's playing chess with dad. It's going down to the train show. It's listening to music that you like. Whatever it happens to be, if it's an activity that you can't actually visually turn into something that they can see, you find a way to make it a visual thing. Whether that means you get plastic poker chips that become a representation of the amount of time that they spend on this activity, or whatever. They need to have something that they can see, that is real, that is tangible, that they can touch and hold, and that it comes into their hands. Because that is the moment of reward. For a child, my brain gets its dopamine when what I want comes into my hands, because then it's mine. Whether I use it right then or not doesn't matter. It's about when does it come into my hands. When it leaves my hands, that's when I don't control it, that's when I want it. But if it comes into my hands, that's when I get that big dopamine rush. So even if I need, 3 of these blue poker chips to get, 1 episode of this TV show, when I get 1 of those, that's my reward, and I'm happy. And I know I've only got 2 more to go. Seeing those other 2 makes it even more real for me. Now, even though I can't spend this and can't do it because I don't have the 3, it doesn't matter. If I've got it in my hand and that's a part of it, that is the reward in and of itself. So you always want to have very real, tangible things that they can hold, which is why a lot of times parents say, I've tried this. We've used check marks. We've used stickers on the board. It doesn't work. That's not something they can hold in their hands. Putting a check mark on a board it's a check mark. Maybe it might work for some kids if they believe that check mark to be valuable, but it is not the same thing as having something tangible in their hands. It's not the same thing to have somebody give you a $20 bill or $100 bill as it is for someone to say, oh yeah, I transferred $100 into your account. Doesn't feel the same, even as adults. So those rewards and understanding how those rewards work and the neurobiological basis of rewards is very, very important. And for the question of the child that worries all the time, that is always thinking about stuff, worrying about stuff, one of those important things to ask them is, are you imagining these bad things that are happening? If they're worried about this, are they asking the question of what if this happens? What if this happens? Or are they just not doing it or not wanting to do it, and you see the physical response? Because if it's a visual thing, then you need their brains to be not thinking about and not going through those movies, and you need their brains to be focusing on something else that can keep their minds not predicting these bad things. If it's more of a physical activation where it's just not doing it, then mental strategies aren't going to make much difference. You're going to need very real, tangible things. So for some kids, you might be able to get them to imagine their favorite activity, to picture it in their brain, to override, to control the thoughts and the worries about the bad stuff. But if it's just, I'm not doing it, that's not going to be of any benefit to them. If it's more the thoughts, they'll tell you, this is what I'm worried about. They'll say, I'm scared of this. If you ask them, why are you afraid to go to school? If they have nothing there, they might say, I don't know. Is it this? I don't know. Are you worried about this? I don't know. Well, why are you worried if you don't know what you're worried about? I don't know. But if they've got the images, they'll usually tell you, I'm afraid that my friends will be mad. I'm afraid that the teacher's going to be this, or that, teachers are going to yell, or that there'll be another fire drill. And because those sensory issues, if it's a very intense sensory experience, that's unpleasant. That's something that I don't like. And that may be what the fear is about. But can they verbalize that? Can they express that? And that's where the communication problems come in, which is a lot of times they can't. A lot of times they don't even know that they're afraid. I can't tell you how many times I've seen kids come into the office and have clear, intense anxiety. So their bodies start to shake, tears start coming down their face. You can see them start to look around, jitter. It's very clear that fear has been activated. And I'll ask them, what are you feeling right now? And they'll say, nothing. I'll ask them, are you feeling anxious? No. Are you sure? Yeah. Why are your eyes leaking? And they'll say, I don't know. My eyes do that sometimes. It's weird. I don't know why my eyes leak sometimes. And they don't connect the physical experience with an emotional label. Sometimes they connect it with the wrong emotional label. They will say, oh, I'm feeling stressed. I'm feeling this. I'm feeling that. Or we'll give them a label that they just assume must be accurate. even though it may not be, because they don't understand the emotion words that we use to reflect anything that they actually experience. So a lot of times when they have difficulty communicating with us, we need to use our ability to decipher these physical cues, these physical hints that there is a problem with this or that. And we may not be able to rely on them to tell us. We need to watch and observe to figure out, okay, what is the problem here? What's activating this anxiety? Can we avoid it? Can we identify it? Can we get them past it? What do we need to expose them to? Because sometimes it doesn't make sense. You know, why can't you sleep alone at mom's house, but you can sleep alone fine at dad's house? Like at home, you say you're afraid of the dark with mom, but at dad's house, you're not afraid of the dark and you sleep in the dark completely for like 2 nights every week. But you're not doing that at home. But you're saying I'm afraid of the dark. But are they actually afraid of the dark? Or is it just that at mom's house, mom asked them one day, are you afraid of the dark? And they said yes. And because of that, mom said, all right, you can sleep with me tonight. And in their minds, therefore, if I say I'm afraid of the dark, I get to sleep with mom. Is the problem that I've slept with mom and I'm just used to it and I don't want to change it? Whereas at dad's house, because the very first time I went to dad's house, I had to sleep in my own room and it wasn't an option. That's been the established routine over there. And it's not that I'm afraid, even though I may say I'm afraid, because if it's fear that is activated, that's going to be consistent over time. You're going to see them afraid. If you're afraid of spiders, you're afraid of spiders at mom's house, at dad's house, outside, inside. It doesn't matter. Your brain sees a spider, it's going to freak out. But if at dad's house you can play with spiders all you want, but at mom's house you're afraid of spiders, something else is going on, and it's got nothing to do with the fear of spiders. Now, if we don't know what's going on, we can still use rewards, because rewards work, whether it's a Jim problem, whether it's a Bob problem, or whether it's an aphantasia problem. Concrete, tangible, immediate rewards work no matter what. So sometimes it's not important to know what's driving it so much as it is to focus on what we need to get them through, to teach them what to do, and get them to start to model that behavior using rewards to train their brain to want to do this.
I have just a couple more things. Do you want me to wait till the end, or are you?
That's what I was about to say. Is this is the end of the slideshow. This is, you know, the interplay between the ASD, the anxiety, and we've covered it all. So opening the floor for that discussion and those questions.
Perfect. So I've got one. If the chemical reaction from a fear response can be exhausted temporarily after waiting, what explains the tendency for a child with ASD to have a prolonged negative response or tantrum that leaves them oversensitive to further negative stimuli for some time following the initial tantrum?
Is it a tantrum or is it a panic attack? Because a tantrum, if it's I'm not getting what I want, if it's a Jim-driven behavior, Jim can go on for hours. Jim never gets exhausted. That's part of the problem. But if Jim at the end of the day still doesn't end up getting what he wants and does give up, then he's not going to be in the driver's seat. And so then Bob can jump in completely unopposed, and you can see more hypersensitivity, more reactivity to actual legitimate Bob-based experiences, because Jim's just said, forget it, there's no point even talking to you, I'm not getting what I want, I'm done. But that's the main difference between a tantrum and a panic. And if it's anger, if you're seeing anger, anger is almost always Jim, not Bob. The only time Bob drives anger as a response is if they are afraid of something and you are forcing them into that situation, and they can only react with fear, with anger as a fight for survival. So if you're about to throw them over the cliff, they will fight you because they are afraid, but they will only fight you as long as you're going to throw them over the cliff. If you back off and you're like, okay, fine, they're not going to be angry anymore, because anger is strictly defensive. It is stop threatening me. If you stop threatening me, I'm not going to continue to be angry. So if you have a child that it's about going to school, you have to go to school, you have to go to school, and they're freaking out, they may get angry because you're forcing them to go to school. But if you stop trying to force them, they're going to stop being angry. They may continue to be anxious if they think you might, but the anxiety precedes the anger. The anxiety gives rise to anger only once you're about to throw them over that cliff, and will stop once you do. If instead you've got a child that is willing to follow you around the house and to continue to chase you, to berate you, to get in your face, to have a tantrum, to yell, to scream, even once you move away and you're like, whatever, and it doesn't stop, that's not a reaction to fear. That is, I want something and I'm not getting it, and I'm going to react this way until I do. And that can continue for a very long time.
Okay, so this mom mentions that she's never heard of the aphantasia, and it's piqued her interest. So she always thought her son had great imagination. However, based on how you're describing dopamine released activities, is it possible to have aphantasia, which makes a lot of sense when you're discussing what we see in his behaviors, reactions, interactions. But our son will often turn into a dinosaur or pretend to be animals, often correlated when he is what we would call anxious or overloaded or overstimulated or being defiant to an instruction. Is this common with aphantasia, or would this disqualify that since he's able to come up with images to become things?
Right. So what you're seeing there isn't necessarily the imaginative ability so much as it may be a reenactment of a memory. So if I like animals, I study animals, I know a lot about animals, I know that when animals, growl, it means this or do this. I can repeat that behavior that I've seen because it's something that I've witnessed and I've personally experienced. That's not the same thing as being able to imagine what might happen or what might be the outcome of this, or to imagine myself in your shoes to understand your perspective, or to imagine a different reaction or response that I could go through and how that might be taken or interpreted. So, pretending to be an animal, oftentimes you will see these kids react in a very animalistic sort of way to situations. I growl when I'm angry. I will snarl, or I'll get down on all fours when I'm scared. I'll run around, or I'll just lay down on the ground and play dead. But that isn't, I'm imagining myself to be this animal. This is a communication that I understand, that I've learned about, and I'm going to communicate it to you in what I think might be a way that you might understand it. Maybe, I don't know, but I'm going to give it a try. And away we go. It's a type of nonverbal communication, but it's not nonverbal communication that is specific to our species as humans. It's not a nonverbal communication that's completely useful for a totally different species. And so it's not being used appropriately. And if you see that emerging in times of high anxiety, in times of stress, in times of behavioral stuff, then they're understanding that means of communication as a way of messaging that I'm not okay, that there's something that is going on, without understanding that there's a different way. We use different words, we use different behaviors. You don't have to growl at me to say I'm unhappy about this. You can use a look, you can turn your back, you can fold your arms, you can do other things to tell me the same thing instead of just growling and snarling. But they may not know that.
Perfect. I think we've got just one more question. Just following up with the previous and talking about panic versus like wanting something. This parent says that their child seems to be in a state of panic. There doesn't seem to be much downtime. It seems like the panic is prolonged and changing and are evolving, but it doesn't seem like they want anything. So would that be, what would that be considered?
Okay, so if it's panic, you're right. They're not wanting something when they're panicked. When they are panicked, their focus is on escaping something. It is on getting away from something. Now, sometimes they know what it is. Sometimes they don't. Their brains will usually know what it is and will engage in specific behaviors that can give you hints as to what it is that they're escaping from. Sometimes panic activates on its own independently without any trigger. That's what we call a panic attack. A formal panic attack isn't the same thing as an anxiety attack, which is an escalation of anxiety to a panicky state. A panic attack medically is when it's like a seizure in the fear center of your brain, and suddenly your brain is in a state of panic because of electrical activity and not anything to do. And then, yeah, your body goes through all sorts of behavioral responses associated with panic, even though there's literally nothing that triggered it, and it's going to run its course. Panic attacks happen very quickly. They onset very quickly. They last for about half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, and they fade away. And they never last more than 45 minutes, an hour max, because it always fades off and goes down. Having said that, behaviors can look very panicky without it actually being panic. And this is part of what I'm trying to get at with that communication is they don't communicate in a meaningful way in the same way that we do. There are often miscommunications in the things that they do. They may see a behavior and repeat it, making it look like this is what they're trying to communicate, but that may not actually be a reflection of what they're trying to communicate. And some kids may run around in a circle and look panicky, or do this not because they're actually panicky, but because they like it, or because it's an avoidance of something else, not because they're actually scared. So you haven't actually activated that cascade that's going to then wear itself out. It may just be, I'm nervous, but nervous gets interpreted as panic. You can be nervous throughout the entirety of a day. You can activate that fear center a little bit and feel that throughout the day because you're never actually exhausting it. And by the time the neurochemicals go down and get recycled, there was still some up there, so they got down. So it's just a continual cascade. But when you dump it all and there is nothing else to go down, that's when you see the wear off. But they can look extremely panicked, even though that's not actually what they're feeling. And I've seen kids talking to me as teenagers, telling me I'm having a panic attack. And I'll look at them and go, when? They're like, right now. And they're sitting there looking like this. Like, you're having a panic attack right now? Yep. Are you sure? Yep. You're not having a panic attack. Yes, I am. No, you're not. I know this because that's the same thing as you telling me I'm having a seizure right now. But your body's not moving, and you're conscious, and you're aware. If you were having a seizure, it wouldn't be conscious, you wouldn't be aware, your body would be jerking all over the place. It's a medical thing. We know what happens when it happens. If you're not doing that, you may think it's a seizure, but it's not. Clearly, it's not. We know what those are. We know what they look like. And just because you think it is, if the medical doctors are saying that's not what it is, that's not what it is. But again, because they don't understand social hierarchy, they don't understand information sources, they don't trust people in positions of authority, the fact that a doctor says this isn't a panic attack does not, in their mind, change it one bit that this is not a panic attack. They assume that they're right. Doctor doesn't know what he's talking about, and they will continue to call it a panic attack. But is it really? Because a panic attack will die off. It will fade off. It cannot stay maintained at that level. But if it's anxiety, it can. But you have to look at things like the heart rate, the breathing rate, the respiration, the sweatiness, the autonomic signs that tell you this is a panic attack as opposed to just anxious. If I'm dumping noradrenaline in your body causing a panic attack, your heart rate is going 140 or higher. Your blood pressure is going up. You are going to start sweating. Your galvanic skin response, electrical conductivity of your skin is going to go up. Your muscles are going to start to shake because of the lactic acid, because of the carbon dioxide, because you're going to be starting to hyperventilate. If these are actually things that are going on, you will see it. You will be able to recognize it. We can measure it and track it. If you're just, walking around shaking, but walking around and saying, I'm panicky and looking around, but I take your heart rate and it's, 100, blood pressure is not elevated. You may have some features of it, but it's not a panic attack if it's not affecting your heart rate, if it's not affecting things that you can't actually consciously control. You can look like you're doing these things because your brain is aware of controlling certain body things and body movements, but that's not the same thing.
Thank you. And I think just a follow up in terms of the difference with the panic and the kind of constant anxiety, what would you do in terms of just if it's a kind of a low level anxiety, what would you suggest for a parent?
So with it, when it's low level anxiety where they just got these general worries, that's what this last picture is all about. If Bob is in their brain, not making them panic, just worrying about stuff, Bob is going to still be distorting things negatively, misperceiving things negatively, not to a huge degree because it's not actively, activating that much of a negative response, but somewhat. If you don't want them to do that, you need to have Jim in the driver's seat. Jim is only going to be in the driver's seat if he's chasing something that he wants. And in order to get something that he wants, he has to go through certain behaviors. If there is a job that he has to do to get what he wants, then for the entirety of the time that he is engaged in that job, he's going to be in the driver's seat, which means Bob is not going to be in the driver's seat. So you put rewards in place for things that they can do easily every day. They don't need to be big rewards. They just need to be something that they want. And because it's easy to get, it's not going to take an awful lot of effort for them to get it, but they still need to make sure that they get certain things done. And doing that will keep Jim in the driver's seat, which will block Bob from being in the driver's seat. So, for example, you get to play on the video game for an hour if you go to school, and you can tell me, the last thing your teacher said in each class. That's easy to do. I mean, obviously I have to be listening and paying attention to tell you what that is, but I can easily write it down. I can sit there, if you can tell me the names of 3 kids that you played with at recess, at each recess, you get this. That's easy to do. I have to make sure I play with kids or do something, but easy to do. So while I'm engaged in that task, given that the tasks don't end until the end of the day, Jim's going to be in the driver's seat, which means I'm not going to be spending my time worrying. I'm going to be spending my time making sure I get these simple things done and tick off, step A, step B, step C, step D to get to that reward that I do want. And, I used to do this with my son all the time because my son was a big worrier. And it was a very straightforward thing. You go to school, you get to use the computer. And my son would tell me, he's like, and he was 12 at the time. He said, Dad, why do you do that? Why do you make me like, I don't ever miss school. Why do you keep reminding me that if I go to school and I stay in class, I get to use a computer? Like, because that's the point. That's the case, is that if you go to school, you get to use a computer. Like, but I go every day. So yeah, and that's why you get to use a computer every day. But why can't I just use it anyways? Like, why does it matter? I said, because it's like a job. You have to go to work to get your paycheck. You go to work, you get your paycheck. The fact that work isn't hard doesn't mean it isn't tied to that. Like, but it's annoying. I don't want to have to think about, am I going to get the computer at the end of the day? Like, how much you think about it? Like, I'm always thinking about it. I said, good. Why is that good? Because if you weren't thinking about that, you'd be worrying about everything else. Do you remember what you used to do? You used to worry about your friends. You used to worry about if something would happen to mom or me. You used to worry about the dog. Is the dog going to be okay? Is your hamster still alive? Is this going to happen? Is there going to be a storm? That used to be the only thing your brain thought about all day. Now your brain's just thinking about, I got to make sure I do this so I can play. That means that you've had 8 hours less worrying in your head, which is a benefit to you. You may find it annoying, but it's controlling your thoughts for you. And that is extremely important because of development. In our lives, when we are growing up, our brains and our bodies learn to do what we do. We repeat and get better at doing what we are doing constantly. So if I activate a neural network associated with a particular movement, playing the piano, doing a gymnastics, using a particular hand-eye coordination skill, the fact that I activate this tells my brain, build more neurons into this network because we want to get better at it. We're using this all the time, so we need to make it more efficient and better. So the more time I spend activating this network, the stronger that network becomes and the faster and more efficient it becomes. If I am spending 8 hours a day activating Bob is slowly but surely getting stronger and stronger and stronger over time, over the years. That's not what I want. I want Jim to be the one that is activated, because if Bob is already overactive, the last thing I need is for him to get better at doing that. So I need him to be not thinking and using Bob, no matter what. And using a reward, a contingent reward, is the only way you can actually control a child's thought process to make them start thinking about How do I get what I want? How do I get what I want? What am I looking forward to? Instead of activating Bob, because every hour you spend activating Jim is 1 hour less that Bob's getting practice. And that is going to be a benefit down the road. That's going to help to normalize the activation levels of these two processes. Because if you're born with a very overactive Bob right from the get-go and a very underactive Jim, you need to practice a lot of Jim and you need to stop practicing Bob to start getting it back to a level where there's more balance in your brain about what your brain focuses on and thinks on. And that takes time and activation.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Oh, it's my son's birthday today, and so he's bringing out sushi for his birthday dinner. So that's what you hear in the background. Thank you so much for this evening. And again, thank you for taking the time to spend with us. And if families have any questions, they can reach out to me, Sue, or through our autism intake or autisminfo@hnreach.on.ca. And if there's any follow-up questions, I can forward to you, Dr. Templeman, if that's okay, if there's something beyond our scope, maybe.
Yep. And like I said, if there's other questions about anxiety specifically or information processing in autism, if you go to my website and you watch those videos, it's a very similar presentation to this, except it's focused on just on those. So we're able to get into more depth and more examples and more specifics, which may answer your questions.
Perfect. And I'll forward out your website tomorrow to all the people who have attended so that they can access that pretty easily. All right, everyone, have a great night. I've got sushi waiting here for me. So take care, everyone. Thank you.
Welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.